Christine appear. Hi, Ruth. Thank you and welcome. Welcome for being here in this Congress. I really appreciate your collaboration, your participation on this event. Now, Christine will speak a brief resume of Ruth.
Thank you, Carolina. And that was a very interesting presentation by Professor John, very intriguing. And now I have the pleasure to introduce Ruth Stark. So Ruth Stark is an independent social worker at Emeritus. She's the president at Emeritus, an International Federation of Social Workers, the IFSW. Ruth works as an independent social worker in Scotland. She works with people who are experiencing difficulties in family life, in their mental health, in the criminal justice system, and people facing deportation, often a combination of some or all of these issues. Some work comes from the different court systems, some from direct referrals, and some from social work services. In 1996, she gained her Master in Science in Advanced Social Work in Criminal Justice, with research into the aftermath of sexual offending in the family, 20 years on. Later, she was the manager of SASW, part of the BASW for 15 years. She's been involved in setting up the two NGOs, the Family Conciliation Services, and the Scottish Child Law Centre. In 2013, she was awarded an MBE for services to social work in Scotland. Alongside her career in Scotland, Ruth became involved in IFSW in 1989, an organization organizing the 1991 IFSW European Conference in Glasgow. This was just after the Berlin Wall came down, and there were 30 Eastern European delegates for the first time at an IFSW event. In 2008, she became the IFSW Global Human Rights Commissioner. In July 2014, she was elected president of IFSW. She also co-wrote the IFSW training manual on the UN Convention on the rights of children in 2002. In 2019, she was given a new name by invitation of the community, becoming Chief Bomska Kongbana, the third of Mathong section, Loko Sama Chiefdom, Port Local District, Northwest Sierra Leone. In this community, we have co-built an eco-resource center, which you can see as it develops on Facebook. It is built on the principle that it takes the whole village to bring up a child. And when you have no resources, you have to be resourceful. The pages are called Ruth's Hope Kindergarten. This has led to the presentation today about the need for paradigm shifts away from the Northern Hemisphere social work dogma. This presentation, which follows work undertaken in 2022, globally involving the IFSW, the UNRISD, and many other international organizations in co-building the People's Charter for New Eco-Social Worlds. Our work continues, endorsed by the Secretary General of the UN. For sustainable change, we need to find balance globally by changes that we make locally. And with that introduction, I will turn it over to Ruth Stark. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and congratulations for getting through my name from Sierra Leone. It is complicated, but it does give some background to the presentation, because whilst I have had my working life in Scotland and in Northern Europe, My involvement through the International Federation of Social Workers has taken me globally to see how social work works in other countries, in other cultures, and the huge diversity of what we call social work, which is what John was talking about towards the end, that we have so many different cultures, so many different trainings, so many different interpretations of what social work is about. And I think now we have to really examine what it is that we contribute to the world through our professional knowledge, but also what it is, what are the challenges for the future as we face climate change, huge migration across continents, political unrest, huge poverty around the world with very few people with a lot of wealth and vast numbers who are living in poverty and with no resources. And I think that these are some of the challenges that I suspect everybody who is involved in social work and social development is actually involved with. So I'm going to start my presentation. If you want to interrupt at any point, please do so, because there are maybe things that I'm talking about that you would like to have a little bit more explanation about before we get to the challenges at the end about what we can do with some of this new knowledge. And I started in saying that I started being trained in clinical social work. My view about social work has changed over the last 50 years. And I think we have a much more global and local set of challenges ahead of us if we are going to add to the sustainability of our planet and to the well-being of the communities in which we all live. So I am now going to share my screen, I hope, and get to this, which should be the beginning of this presentation. So let's show this right. So I hope you can all see this. So the title that I have here is A New Paradigm for Social Work, Evolving from the People's Charter for an Eco-Social World. And what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about how the Charter came to be in place, to give some background, and then talk about what I think it means for social work in the future. And there is a place somewhere in all of this for clinical social work, but there is also a much wider environment in which we operate, where we can use our skills, our transferable skills, to do something a little bit more constructive in working in new partnerships and with new challenges. So, a new paradigm for social work. Here, I've put on the QR code, which you can just use now, which will take you to explaining a little bit about the challenges, opportunities for social workers in partnership with people and communities. So this QR code will take you to the People's Charter. It will explain the background to it, how it came to happen as a natural progression from the global crisis of COVID into all of us around the world saying, this is time for us to do things a little bit differently because our world is at risk. And we need to be able to make sure that we leave no one behind and we still have a planet to live on. So, in 2022, through IFSW and through the United Nations Research Institute in Social Development, which is the other partner organization that helped pull together the People's Global Summit, we had 26 diverse global organizations representing millions of people, spurred on by saying, post-COVID, we need to do something different. Climate change means we need to do something different. The energy crisis meant we need to do something different. And the economic crisis meant we need to do something differently. And what we needed to do is to start working together about sustainability and well-being. So this really went much further than what we might do with individuals, how we might work with children, how we might work with families. It was about the environment. It was about global health. It was about our ability to sustain and live with the earth as a living organism. And it meant a real challenge to the global economics, politics, and our solidarity with each other. Because one of the huge agreements came out of millions of people getting together, and I'm sure this is very true in wherever we are in the world, the one thing that we do not want to live with is violence. And so many of the current environmental contexts in which we all live, one of our biggest fears is violence. And this came through very strongly in the People's Global Summit and became a real piece of glue, a bit of glue to keep us focused on what we wanted to achieve in terms of sustainability and well-being. And that kind of was jogged along quite a long way by people struggling again with the concept of the Millennium Development Goals hadn't worked. Halfway through the Sustainable Development Goals, are we going to make it? Are we going to make any difference to our world? We've had climate change, really has affected so many millions of people in terms of their livelihood, the land that they have historically lived in, and has fueled the migration that is happening across the world. So these are some of the big drivers from the global state of our all of our countries that we need to have a different way of working with. So this is about us as a profession, as people who work with in social situations, saying, how can we use our transferable skills with people to work together for a collective future? And economically, and with climate change, and with all the other things that are happening, political changes, the wars that are going on around the world, there's a changing global axis, which is moving away from the global north and involving people in Asia and in Africa and in Latin America to a much greater extent in terms of some of the things that are happening and how change can be turned into a positive rather than a negative, that we are all undergoing a paradigm shift, wherever we live in the world. And this has been one of the things that has come out of the Global People's Summit about what we need to do in the future and how we need to refocus what we have understood for the last 100 years to be what social work has been about. Actually, what social work was about 100 years ago was, in a sense, some of the same things that it's about now. It's about how people adapt and change to environmental change. And 100 years ago, we had we had, first of all, had an agricultural revolution, we had an industrial revolution, then we had colonization, then we've had all sorts of things happen within our world. And what social workers have been about is about helping and working with people as we all face up to the new change in how our world works and what we gain from it. Now, in the course of millions of people getting together online, we established 5 key principles, which I think, as John was talking about in the last presentation, form ethical framework for the way that social workers work around the world. And I'm really pleased that we are beginning now to have a recognition of Indigenous knowledge in terms of expressing what those principles are about. And you'll see that number 1 and number 4, one is from Latin America, one is from Africa. And as we develop this living charter, we will, I'm sure, identify other philosophies, other cultures, other Indigenous knowledge that will support the formation of an international solidarity about where we want our world to be in the next period of evolution. Because it is about evolution, it's about an organic process about how we adapt to change. And even though we didn't have social workers called social workers in the 500 years ago, there were people in our communities who brought their skills of helping people come together and support each other. And we should not ignore their knowledge or their history, because that is important in what we can learn about, what we can take forward. And I think for me, one of the big changes in my 50 years of being in social work is moving from this individual focus in Western models of social work, which have been exported across the world. It has been this change from the individual, from the family, from concentrating on the silo in which a person might be seen to exist, to actually recognize our interdependence with each other, the complexity of what we do, and the holistic world in which we are trying to find the connections where we can support peer support, that we can involve communities in meeting the needs of everyone in that community, so that everybody has a sense of belonging. So we got Buen Vivir, which was the last and the current theme for World Social Work Day. Love and care for people and the planet, and our responsibilities to each other. The holistic rights. Respect, dignity, harmony, and social justice, which have traditionally been there and emphasized, perhaps overemphasized in Northern Hemisphere social work. Because social justice also includes competing rights. We have to have a balance between rights. There may be a right for a mother who has mental health issues, who may want to or need to have some support with her mental health issues. There's also the right of the child to be looked after and to be brought up without being adversely affected by the issues from perhaps a mental health condition of a parent or a grandparent or whatever. So there are competing rights, and that's where the justice bit comes into it. But my sense of social justice may be different from somebody else's sense of social justice, because I see it from my own perspective, not necessarily from somebody else's. So there's a huge complexity in some of the ethical decisions and some of the ethical thinking we do around the principles in which we work. Diversity, of course we must respect diversity. In diversity, there's a richness, but there's also the necessity to give space for everyone and everything to belong. That reciprocity and that equality of belonging is really important in terms of how we live in harmony with each other and with our planet. Ubuntu, togetherness. I am because we are. We do not exist. As John Donne said, no man is an island in himself. We live in communities, and community is as important in social work practice as is clinical social work, because we don't live alone and we don't live in little silos. And that is why we need to use our skills in building solidarity, equality, inclusion, and collaboration. So those are the principles on which the Charter was founded. And I'm just going to highlight two stories which you can easily access. One's on the IFSW news list at the moment, and it comes from a visit made last week by the Secretary General to a community in Nairobi, which had been in a slum in the city, where there was no infrastructure, no drainage, there was a lot of drug addiction, there was unemployment, and it really was, people didn't want to stay there long because it was such a dangerous place to live. And in 2005, a social worker called Evans was living there with some colleagues, and they managed to make connections in the community so that they have now co-built partnerships to co-build and run essential infrastructure when the political leadership that one might have expected would have helped promote that infrastructure was just not there. And another example comes from Sierra Leone, where I'm a chief, where we had a similar kind of problem in the northwest of the country, where it's a rural community where there's fishing and there's agriculture. But after a civil war that ended in 2011, there'd been lots of international aid coming in, doing surveys, saying we got to do with teenage pregnancies. But actually what we really wanted was something that was long-term, sustainable recovery of the local economy, to keep people in the area, to keep them working the land, to be fishing in clean waters, which had become polluted from the city, the way that the current went in the city. So the community came together to say, we got a non-functioning government, we need to find ways to deal with this. Hence that comment about, if we do not have resources, we have to be resourceful. And in this context, and in Nairobi, And I suspect in a lot of other places where we have non-functioning governments, which the Western models, the Northern Hemisphere models of social work have relied on as part forming an infrastructure, where those don't exist, our resources are our communities. And our communities can be very, very resourceful because they have skills, they have knowledge of the land, they know what it is that is needed in order to create functioning communities. And I'm just going to throw in here that I come from Scotland, which is sort of north of England in the UK. And you may not know this, but we were the first country in the world to ever have a social work Scotland Act, a piece of legislation. And it was in 1968, and the vision, which goes back to the culture of Scotland, which is different from England, was the promotion by the local authority of social well-being, so that nobody felt left behind. And that's a very important principle to consider in terms of what is social work, because it is about how people live together in communities. Some of the other things that we do, which have been talked about, are very important. But let's consider what it's about. So here we are in Sierra Leone. That's a community meeting at the top of the page. Everybody is invited. We have stakeholders. So we had the agricultural workers, we had the farmers, we had blacksmiths, we had the youth, we had the women's groups, we had the health services, we had the teachers, we had the children. Everybody had a say in what they wanted to happen to the community to make it better, because neither government nor international NGOs sent in with humanitarian aid had been able to help them co-build and co-create a local thriving economy that provided for people within the community. And in 2019, we started to build our own eco-social, sustainable, accessible resource centre, which had a school, a health centre, a technical college, a faith room, because we had many different faiths, a community garden, a backpackers hostel to create income from potential tourists, and so on. And this was what people felt was important for their future, to keep their children, their families, and their friends living in the area which otherwise had been devastated and had no real communication with the outside world, or in between the villages where roads were non-existent and so on. And if somebody had asked me 50 years ago if I would ever become an expert in sewage systems as a social worker, I would have laughed. But my goodness, some of these things are so essential, and finding the resources to help build biodegradable toilets is really, really important, because that helps health infrastructure. It helps people begin to feel that they belong and they can actually own their own futures in a very positive way. Really important stuff. And you'll hear more about that from Mayaka, who I know is going to be talking about the Ubuntu practitioner. And we've written a chapter which relates to our work in Sierra Leone. So all of this is about international solidarity. We are sharing this expertise. We're sharing this knowledge about how we work with communities and how we bring people together to actually get the kind of paradigm shift to meet the challenge of the changing global access. And that's really, really important. And the more that I'm looking forward to reading more about what's happening in Latin America, perhaps coming to see what's happening in Latin America in terms of some of this different ways of working in social work, which I think can teach the West and the Northern Hemisphere a huge amount. There were 5 actions that were identified that we can do together. And I think these are really quite important in terms of rethinking where practices like clinical social work and that expertise that we have developed at one level can be transfer some of those skills into some of the wider issues that are going to make a big difference to our futures. And we've divided them up into the 5 main areas that were predominantly coming from the Global Summit. So there's the ecological integrity, and I know the presentations throughout the conference about what's happening through climate change and our sustainable coexistence. There's economic reform. And there are some countries, some smaller countries, particularly led by women, and I'm thinking in this instance of New Zealand, and when Jacinda Ardern was there, of moving the measuring of economic success by governments from the economy must grow, we must make profit, to actually focusing on sustainable well-being of people. And this is happening in all sorts of different areas. And I think that this is really important that we recognize that this environment of the global economic market is at a critical point. And financiers are at a critical point where they are recognizing that this is potentially another global disaster. And so we need to be focusing on locally what's happening with our national and continental economies, but we also need to be focusing on global economic activity, because otherwise that gap between the very rich and the increasingly large number of very poor people in the world will get wider and wider. So it's a very important part to bear in mind when we're talking about social work and its role in terms of the future of our planet. International solidarity, from national introspection to global cooperation. So many of the issues that we are now facing know no national borders. They go beyond national borders. And some of that comes from multinational companies. I haven't been to a country yet in where employment and work hasn't figured somewhere on the social agenda. Because I think if you are undervalued, if you're not recognized, if you are not recognized with the dignity that everybody's entitled to, that leads to civil unrest, it leads to unhappiness, it leads to all the things, all the negatives that we know go on because of our social work knowledge. But the other one that emerged out of the Global Summit that really is a real issue for us to consider between the global north, which tends to be the more affluent part of the world, where there's so much provided by public spending, is that actually in a lot of countries it's not working. There are people who are falling below the safety net. There's poverty in Northern Europe and the Northern Hemisphere, just as there is in other parts of the world. We have to relook at this balance between what is state social protection and what is public investment in well-being. Because and that takes us into the political situation and why social work is a political, it contributes to our political knowledge about how we should be governed and how we should also consider leaderful communities, because the two are not mutually exclusive. And I'll come back to that a bit later on. So, ecological integrity. I think you will see that from looking at the programme, I think there'll be quite a lot in terms of the programme which will go into this in quite a lot of detail. But we need to respect our ecosystems, because if we don't recognise our ecosystem, our interdependence with the world around us, we are going to have many more issues to do with migration of people around the world. Now, that's not new in the history of the world, but it is going to be it is already a critical problem, and it already causes a lot of distrust, which as social workers, we need to be involved in rebuilding trust between people and acknowledging that we have responsibilities with each other and with our planet. I talked a little bit about the economics and how we need economic reform. And there's a lot of leadership coming from the United Nations from the civil service side, not a lot of leadership coming from the members of the United Nations who take the decisions, so the individual governments. And there is a third ally in this, which is the multinational companies who sit outside of national boundaries and therefore outside of our political systems. And one of the things that we are beginning to explore as a result of this summit is how global ethical finance works. And there are organizations like the Global Ethical Finance Initiative that recognize that we are heading for an economic calamity globally if we don't start talking with each other about impact of the current economic markets, which go beyond national and international boundaries and actually operate outside of these national boundaries, and what's happening to people. Because if we ignore that, we are not going to be able to make the kind of progress as social workers in our communities that we would want to make. And that's why we have to have this international solidarity, from national introspection to global cooperation. We are now in a world where our national borders are ignored by climate change, wars, the air and the sea. We have to get into a different framework about thinking, what is social work practice? How do we work with people who have no status in our world because they are refugees, because they are displaced people, because they're migrating across countries? They don't have the kind of identity that is required by nations to live in community freely in our world. Going to the Middle East, going to Jordan, going to Africa, you find huge cities of refugee camps where people have no rights, have no identification. And they live within other countries, but their freedom of movement is nil. And the way that they live is a world within another world. These are the kinds of things that we really have to now begin to tackle, and causes all sorts of issues. But employment and work is for everyone. And if you go to one of these refugee cities, you find that they have rebuilt a kind of economy where where people do work, where they do support each other, where they do provide schooling. And what are we doing as social workers in terms of helping people to live together, to support each other? And one of the things that we were able to do in Sierra Leone so easily was in our community meeting. We needed to find out where our resources were, where our skills were for people to contribute to building the community resource center. And they were sitting there in the disabled group because they had the mobility, the freedom to get round, and they had the skills to bring the statistics together to help us work out what we could do. And it changed their lives completely within the community because people recognized that they had something really positive to offer to the creation of something that the whole community needed. So rather than hiving people off into, as we do in this country, in the UK, into disabled workshops or whatever, let's involve people in the community. Let's get people fully involved in the community, not in little silos, not in little workshops where they're segregated from the rest of the community. Those are the kinds of rethinking of what are we doing as social workers that makes people's lives bearable. And I think the pandemic just demonstrated to everybody that we have to move out of silo thinking, and we have to be much more responsive to our interdependence with each other. We're co-designing preventative and responsive support systems that fulfill the rights and meet the needs of people. That is a much more inclusive way of working, and it's a much more sustainable way of working, because once it's up and running, social workers can move away, can move into another area, can do something different, because we have socially functioning communities where there is peer support, where there's mutual support, and it really will work. Now, that doesn't decry everything that we might want to say about the importance of clinical social work, because that is important. People who have traumatic experiences need at times individual and familial and neighborhood support. That's a given. But this is about not being confined to that as a way of doing social work. This is to be aware that that's a part of it, because it may include need to be observant about social protection, to stop people being harmed. It may be about social welfare, to make sure that people aren't left out, that they are included. It may include a bit of social administration. Sometimes we have to have some kind of order in order that we can get things done efficiently. And there is a role for government in social policy development, as there is a role for communities in social development. But the one thing that we do have as social workers are social skills. All of that training is about how do we engage with people? How do we create relationships? How do we support relationships that keep people going positively? And I think for me, over the last 50 years, instead of looking for the problems we have to face, I now go into a situation and I listen to what people have already done. We talk about what they have got, which are positive, and then we move forward. And we move forward building on the positives. And so our language is changing. I now don't use the words client, service user, them. I now use the words we, us, our shared futures. What are we going to do together? How are we going to make this assessment? How are we going to do this? And I think that one of the issues that comes through for me after all of these years is I have learned that from Africa. I've learned it from Asia. I've learned it from Latin America. And I think we are in a paradigm shift of moving away from some of the ways that we have done or written about social work. And I think we're moving to something which is much more exciting, much more positive, but I hope is much more sustainable. And that's about how we work with people to find joint solutions for the joint issues that we have helped create and the ones that we need to work together to find solutions for and to prevent some of the things happening in the future. So I invite you to think about social work. I invite you to think about the role of clinical social work in terms of the promotion of social well-being and the sustainability of our planet. And join in with this new social contract that we're trying to work out globally and locally about how we can create a new world where we can all live together equally and with respect and peacefully, and where we are not threatening our whole infrastructure through climate change and through economic disaster and through man-made problems of wars and conflict. Thank you.
Many thanks, Ruth, for your experience. Really, it's an honor to have you here in CAPA. And I would like to ask people if someone like to say any questions. This is the moment for talking.
Do we have any questions?
No. I think your PowerPoint is not see. We can see.
I'm just trying to see if there's any.
But people say hello from Chile, from Peru too, because it is passing in YouTube channel also. So some people here and other people in YouTube channel. And after the Congress finish, we will pass to subtitles in Spanish. Yeah, but what do you think will be the big problems in the world for this relationship between the nature and the role of the social workers? What need to do the social worker for get better, no? And try to solution the problems of the world.
I think there's a real challenge for us now, because the world is fast moving towards some real calamities happening, and yet we are sitting here with a lot of skills. Wherever we work, you know, it could come from indigenous knowledge, because of all the where we have been in over the years, and I think that one of the big issues that we face is that everything, when we read it in the media, is phrased in a negative way. I mean, I'm addicted to news, and I read about wars. I read about what's happening. Oh, I can read a lot about what happens in the Northern Hemisphere. You can read a lot about what happens in Ukraine. You can hear a lot about what happens between Israel and Palestine. What you don't hear about are the 120 other wars that are going on in the world. The conflicts in Asia, the conflicts in Africa, and what's happening particularly in Latin America, unless it's something like Argentina's economic collapse, or what's happening in Bolivia. And so our media is feeding a lot of negative things that are happening. Whereas I think that when I came into social work, I wanted to make a difference. I wanted things to be much better. And then I found myself doing what I would call being required to be a sort of social policeman. You know, go in and do child protection work and that kind of stuff, or go and work with individuals about the problems with their families and so on. And I thought, well, yeah, that's useful and it helps people to develop. But actually, some of the problems we're dealing with are very much influenced by some of the more global issues. Migration is one of them. One of the reasons I work with people with deportation, facing deportation now, is they're trafficked to this country, and they suffer a lot of abuse on the way. They're robbed, they're physically and sexually abused, they're subject to modern day slavery. They arrive probably after about 2 years of traveling across various continents in various different ways. They arrive in this country, they know nobody, and then they might arrive in London, and then they're shipped up to Glasgow, where they can't understand the English because it's not the English that they're used to hearing. But they settle here, and then they live here for about 10 years. They don't have good social contacts, so they may self-medicate by taking drugs. They may get involved in crime. They may get involved in being discriminated against, because that's what happens, and they may end up fighting. They may end up in prison. If you end up in prison for over a year in a Scottish prison or in a UK prison, you are automatically on the route for deportation. And after somebody's been out of the country for 15, 20 years, they have no more contacts left in the country they left. And so there's a huge human dilemma about what should happen. Should they be allowed to stay in the UK? Or should they be deported? And in the recent UK government situation, they want to send them to Rwanda, where they may come from Syria, they may come from the Lebanon. But no, we'll take them to Rwanda, because that's where the government politicians have worked out that's where it's going to happen. So people's rights are being pulled apart. Oh, you know, they have not been recognized as individual people with skills and with who want to be involved in relationships, and they haven't been in that situation for maybe 15, 20 years. Our local authorities in our social protection system do not work with them. Our state social protection system ignores them because they do not have a UK identity. So as an independent social worker, I can go and do reports, I can go and argue in the courts, I can do all sorts of things. If I was working for the state, I wouldn't be able to do that. That is a serious problem because there are thousands of people, millions of people going through migration, and they hit all sorts of different national problems into the countries that they're arriving into where they have no identity. And that is a huge problem. And I know it's a huge problem when people from Latin America go up to the US. And if you get Trump back again, we're going to have even more. So these are real issues that are not going to go away. And we're quietly not, as a profession, who ought to be responding to people in these kind of situations. We need to exercise some international solidarity, an exchange of how we help people get out of being exploited in these kind of situations. So I think that's why I'm saying it's really, really important to think about learning the skills that we have to do this, but how we apply them shouldn't be dictated by governments, shouldn't be dictated by regulators. It should be dictated by what we ethically know we should be doing. And I think for me, the People's Charter and what it embodies and the way that it is focusing actually begins to address some of those issues. I don't know if that made any sense at all, but it's some of the drivers about why I think we've got to take a real hard look at what we do as social workers, and what we're requiring social workers to do.
Yeah, and we saw your work, no? Because you work as independent and you always doing something, helping people. So I really say congratulations because you already done a lot, no? And you're as an example for us. I really appreciate your work, all the research you had. And really, we are here in Latin America, and sometimes people doesn't realize because doesn't live so close to those countries that are so far, no? And but we have a lot of fights, troubles on this area that you mentioned, and we saw the social workers try to do something, try to help people on the borders, you know, and this is really a great example that you are showing us, no, to know how to act here in South America and try to, as you say, you know, to work with solidarity with our colleagues.
I think that's why being an active part of the International Federation of Social Workers has has been so important in my work. I've learned so much. I now bring it back and I use it in Scotland, you know, because I just find that some of the ways certainly that I've learned from Asia and from Africa in particular, I've just been so exciting and so different and so quick to get results, you know. I just think I think it's amazing, and I do think that international exchange is really, really important. And thank you for listening to my ramblings.
It's okay. It's okay. You're just on time. O sea, you just had the times that you did everything quickly and we understood. And later, our friends that are watching us will see the subtitles in Spanish. We will try to do for that they could read in Spanish. Don't worry. Más bien, it's an honor that you are here in CAPA Social Work in this Congress, and I would like to see you again. Maybe it's the first time. Yeah, no, not only this time, maybe another time. Yeah, now you are a friend of us, and I would like to continue working together for the social workers from Latin America or Ibero-America knows this kind of experience that you have, and all this knowledge you have must pass through the channel in YouTube. So I would like that everybody knows what you must do, teach us, no? With all the beauty experience you have. And thank you again for being here.
Thank you.